Hello. We're talking about chapters 6 and 7, the economic indicators, and I've given you something on Tapley which I think will help you. So I'm going to make a brief run through so you can listen to this as many times as you want to. Hopefully it'll be helpful as you prepare for the first test, which is chapters 1 through 7. We're concentrating on 6 and 7 right now. What I'd like to do is switch over from this to Aplia. If you go to Aplia, in the upper right-hand corner, one of the tabs is Course Materials. Click on Course Materials and move on down, and you'll find under Classroom Handouts something that I've referred to as Economic Indicators. When you click on Economic Indicators, you're going to come to this PDF. Print it up and follow along as we read. The first economic indicator we studied is GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross Domestic Product is the value of a nation's production for the year. It's often equated with the standard of living for that country's citizens, especially in regards to per capita GDP, which is calculated by dividing total GDP by the population. The GDP is useful in three main ways. First, when comparing it to other time periods, or second, by comparison to other countries, and third, by indirectly indicating changes in the price level, also known as inflation. The GDP is a trailing indicator. The GDP is used to identify a recession, which is at least two consecutive declining quarters of the GDP. The GDP has its limitations, however, and neglects significant production taking place, like household activities, which are like subsistence farming, self-reliance. It neglects to measure illicit activities, which typify the underground economy and black market. Additionally, the GDP doesn't consider, among other things, and in here the list is long. So which ones you put down are somewhat reflective of you. I might put down pollution, might put down life expectancy, might put down political freedom, I might put down many things that are important considerations when evaluating the typical living standards in a region. When we review it in class, I'd expect you to be able to identify it. Anything that the government knows about and is a true measure of the economy is something that would be on. Let me see here. Okay. So, and anything that the government actually knows about, then that would add to the GDP, and anything that adds to your standard of living, which is not part of the GDP calculation, is something that would be illegitimate or declines from the GDP. For instance, leisure time and things along that nature. The next economic indicator is the CPI, which stands for the Consumer Price Index. It is a measure of changes in the aggregate price level, or also inflation. The CPI is calculated by totaling the price of over 80,000 items in a basket of goods which a typical consumer buys. This amount is then compared to a base year and reported. The CPI is best known as the cost of living, and the CPI for the country is derived from the CPI changes from over 70 metropolitan statistical areas or urban regions. It's used in labor negotiations and to determine COLAs, also known as cost of living allowances. The CPI is limited in several ways. There is a bias because only prices from population centers, so that's the urban bias, ignoring rural areas. Another limitation is that there's very little adjustment for changes in buying behavior in the face of uneven price level changes, so there's a substitution bias because, of course, actual people substitute high-priced, low-priced things in place of high-priced things. There is no internal piece in the CPI which accounts for advancements in quality, so there's a technology bias, and that technology bias remains frozen between base years. Lastly, there's a bias because there isn't a mechanism to account for taste, preferences, and needs, which vary widely across demographic groups. In other words, there is a consumer bias because no one is the typical consumer. The CPI is reported every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is also responsible for measuring unemployment. So that helps us with the CPI as a measure of inflation. Of course, we know that the GDP can also be used that way, and there's other measures of unemployment, or other measures of inflation as well. But it's the CPI which we're interested in because its consumption is such an important part of our economy. Consumer confidence is such a big part of our economy, and therefore consumer price index is such an important measure of inflation. If we move down just a little bit to the bottom piece here, we'll be able to identify the last pieces of our questions. All right, let me see, we'll do it in blue. If we had a population of 150 million in a particular country, our actual country has a population that's more than double that, and 31 million retired, 19 institutionalized unemployed. What we'd want to do is be able to figure out the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. That's the kind of thing I'd calculate on there. In order to help you along there, I'm going to draw a large box. This large box is tantamount. Let me show you where we're going with this. The particular boxes that we're trying to imitate here is this one, where we have a total population of 150. And then out of that number of people, some of them are going to be under 16, some of them are in the armed forces, some of them are institutionalized, for instance, in hospitals or in school or things like that. So, and prisons. So the civilian non-institutionalized population is the first number we're trying to get at, and we get at it by subtracting whatever is in this group from the 150, and that'll leave over that. So if we jump back quickly to our come down to here, then we're going to see that we're looking at 150, 31 retired, 19 institutionalized, 8 unemployed. So this makes it pretty straightforward to go. If it was a more complicated problem, we might have to go into deeper, but I think we know where to put the 31, the 19, and the 8. So let's shoot on back to this, and we'll see if we can pick it up. So we have 150 here. Whoop. Sorry about that. So there's 150 in the total population. I believe we had 8 people unemployed. I think we had, was it 19 and 32, something like that? Yes, 19, 8, and 31. So we had people that were retired, it was 31, the number of institutionalized was 19, and 8 unemployed. So that means if we had 150 here and 19 of them were institutionalized, then that leaves us with, I believe, 131 in the civilian non-institutionalized population. It was 131 million. With 31 not in the labor force, that leaves us with 100 in the labor force. With 8 of them unemployed, then that means there's 92 of them are employed. If we wanted to figure out what the labor force participation rate is, then what we would do is say that 100 out of 131, 100 out of 131 possible are participating in the labor force, and that would give us our percentage. If we wanted to figure out what the unemployment rate was, the unemployment rate would be equal to the 8 people that are unemployed out of the 100 that are trying to work. 92 of them are successful, 8 of them are not. That leads to a percentage as well. If we calculate that out, we can see that the unemployment rate is 8%. Labor force participation rate works out to a, we can do it longhand if we want to, since we're not allowed to use calculators on the quiz, or on the test. So what we would do is take 100, put the 131 in place of it, take that decimal, carry it over 2 decimal places. We know 131 goes into 1,000 roughly 8 times. Let me see, 8 and 24, not quite times. So 7 and 1 and 8. And that leaves us with, oops, sorry, 7, no. That leaves us with 83, 830. And that gives us about 6. So when we look at the answers, roughly, when we look at the answers, what you're going to have is like A, B, C, D. What is the labor force participation rate? And I'll say something like it's 10%, it's 31%, since that's there, it's 69%, it's 75%, it's E, 92%. So the numbers are pretty far apart, and as long as you can zero in, you can go. I know it's definitely more than 70% and nowhere close to 92%. So none of those answers make sense. So you must do D, even though it's not exact, and you don't need to be that close, because I'm not asking you really to be precise on this one. I'm asking you, it's enough for me to know where you're at on there. I just thought it might set you at ease if you could see me do a few like that, and it would set your mind at ease. Lastly, we get down to the bottom here, what's happened to the natural unemployment rate over the past 15 years. In that case, you say, what has happened in the last 15 years is we have the internet, that's the Y. And the internet has allowed for efficiencies. Efficiencies in finding a job, efficiencies in getting people to know that you are looking for them and finding the right person fast. So instead of it taking a long time to find for the employer and the employee to find each other, it's taken a little time. And that has happened because of the internet. And so the natural unemployment rate has dropped from 5% in the last century to 4% in this century. And that's because it's more efficient. Technology has improved our efficiency. Lastly, the shirt maker in Troy is a structurally unemployed person. An auto worker who's out of work right now is cyclically unemployed. A ski instructor is seasonally unemployed right now, but that's until the season starts up. And a new graduate is frictionally unemployed. Thank you very much, and have a great day.